Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Equity Conference, the second day. We have had a brilliant start to the morning, and we have a great slate of afternoon sessions. And we're going to begin here with Dr. Gina Garcia, Transforming HSIs. To introduce myself, I'm Dr. Tracey Salisbury, Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies from Cal State Bakersfield. I am a light-skinned woman wearing a light brown top. I have very long salt and pepper dreadlocks. And I am what you would call a Southern California girl. I am originally from Los Angeles, California, but I also claim North Carolina as my second home. So that's where this little Southern accent comes from. I'm going to get us started today with a land acknowledgement. Okay. And we want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional land of the indigenous people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time and immemorial. It is important to understand the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek and to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgement, do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process. We need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. I personally want to honor that I am on Yokut land, which represents the city of Bakersfield, and is oftentimes overlooked because we are not the wealthy Tejon tribe, which our school likes to connect to. We represent everyone and not just the people that are federally recognized. It is my great pleasure to introduce Gina Garcia. I am a huge fan of Dr. Garcia. She was recently at my institution. She put on two dynamic speeches and a workshop. And I insisted that she be a part of this conference, and I was luckily supported by my colleagues to bring her. I want to give a little introduction of her bio for everybody, and then we'll let her get started. Dr. Gina N. Garcia is a leading scholar on Hispanic Serving Institutions, HSIs, which are colleges and universities that enroll at least 25% Latinx undergraduate students. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Administrative and Policy Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, specializing in higher education and student affairs. She is a scholar activist committed to disrupting the status quo of post-secondary education by bringing attention to the ways higher education has historically been committed to whiteness and regularly reinforces white narratives and white standards. Connecting critical and organizational theory, Dr. Garcia's research centers Latinx and HSIs and is guided by the principle of equality and justice. Let's please welcome my fellow California homegirl back home to share with us her gifts. Please, Dr. Garcia, go forth.
Thank you, Dr. Tracey, for that amazing introduction. I love it. And I love that I get to be on this panel with you after sharing space with you earlier this year. It's an honor to speak with y'all today. I do want to acknowledge the land that I am calling in from, because I am not in California, although I am a California girl through and through. I'm not calling in from California today. So I am joining you from the land of the Adena and Hopewell Nations and the Monongahela peoples, a space that has been shared by many indigenous communities, currently known as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but has been a passing through area many many Indigenous communities have passed through. It's also been a site of freedom, as in Pennsylvania, a site of freedom, meaning that it's a place where many people escaped to in the North during the Civil War and beyond, as a place where there could be freedom, right, as a site of freedom. So it's got a lot of important history, and I take time to acknowledge that history and the complexities of it. I use she, her, pronouns. I am wearing a rose-colored sweater that has some design in it. My lipstick matches the sweater intentionally, so it's also rose-colored. I am light brown skin Latina woman with long brown dark hair. I also wear earrings today that have the word chingona on them, which Latinas and Latinx femmes have claimed as a word to that we embrace to enact our power and to really just show up and like in unapologetically in various spaces. So I wanted to make sure I brought that to your attention, because people do sometimes get caught up in trying to figure out what does the earring say. So that's what it says. Before I start sharing my slides and start talking a little bit about transforming HSIs and what that means to really enact an identity for serving Latinx students and other students of color, because HSIs are super diverse, which I'm going to share some data about that. I want to talk a little bit about my own positionality and connection to California. And as an alum and or daughter, I've heard the term daughter of HSI, and I just love that, because I do this work with HSIs out of love and commitment and advocacy for HSIs. It's not something I just do. It's not just to get tenure. It's not just so I can publish books. It's actually because I care and am committed to HSIs. And so part of that is because I am a product of the system, and specifically of the Cal State system. I also have a degree from the University of California, so very much educated in the public college system in California, and proud of that, and very proud to do this work and continue to work with all three systems in California, working increasingly with the California community colleges as well to figure out servingness. Like, what is this idea of servingness? So as I do this talk and talk through what this means, I want you to keep that in mind, that although I'm calling in from one of the whitest institutions in the country, literally, I very much am a product and have served in various ways in HSIs. Okay, so let me first acknowledge the artwork that is on my Prezi slides, artwork by Judy Baca. Maybe some of y'all have been to this enormous mural that Judy Baca created in the LA River that has various stages of the history of Latinos in the LA area. This part is called Nonviolent Resistance. It's one portion of the larger mural. And I do like to use artwork, various forms of art within my presentations, mostly because when I first started doing HSI work and in my dissertation, when I asked people, what does it mean to be an HSI? I got an answer that I hadn't expected, which is the fun part of research, is you go in with one idea and you come out with other things that people share with you and you make sense of that. And one of the responses was that the artwork on campus made people feel like it was an HSI. And so that was really powerful. And I also had to explore that as a researcher and, ask people, well, what do you mean the artwork? How is the artwork your definition of servingness? What does that even mean? And people shared that the artwork that they were referring to was in ethnic studies, right? The building where ethnic studies was housed. There were multiple ethnic studies programs at this HSI. And they said, well, over there in that building, and they named the building, there's artwork. And it makes me feel like I belong, or it makes me feel like it's an HSI. And so the artwork is powerful. And so I invite you into this conversation about HSIs, thinking about what does it feel like to be an HSI? Rather than thinking, how do we measure it? Or what are the dimensions? All of words I've used in my own research. I invite you to just think about, what does it feel like? And what would it feel like to be in a space of what I often call HSIs? How I dream, my freedom dream is that HSIs would be spaces of liberation. And so I think it aligns very closely with y'all's commitment and this conference, the themes around social justice and racial equity and healing. All of those things I think could be a part of HSI. They're not there yet. They're not part of the federal designation. The federal government doesn't say HSI should be spaces of liberation. I acknowledge and very much embrace that that's my own understanding of what I think HSIs could be, because the people are there. The people are there, the students at the student level. There's many people I've met, many of y'all included in this session that are committed to the work and that can advance HSIs as spaces of liberation. So that's what I want you to think about as I go through this, is like, what do I do to lead for social justice and racial equity in order to create a space for justice and space for liberation for our students? Because that's how I think about it. And so I want you to dream with me a little bit. Or as I call in the book, which I'm referring to today, is actually a book that's almost done, hopefully will be out next year, called Transforming HSIs. And I use the term freedom dream, my own freedom dream. So I invite you to freedom dream with me. So HSIs, the federal government just says 25% Hispanic or Latinx enrollment, 50% low income. That's it, eligible HSI. The two figures on the right are from Excellency in Education, and they basically just show the power of HSIs and that the growth in HSIs are becoming very prominent in the field of higher education. That if we don't think about HSIs now, we're gonna miss this, what I would say, a sleeping giant, right? And already HSIs are already pretty massive, with 569 institutions already identifying as HSIs and 362 that are very close. That's a lot. It's a lot of institutions that are trying to figure out HSI. I don't think anybody's figured it out. So if one of the questions you have for me is there a model HSI? The answer is no. I think everybody's trying to figure out. This screen has a lot, so I'll let y'all take it in for a second, and then I'll describe it. So this typology comes from an article that I published a few years back as I was trying to make sense of an HSI identity. I was like, well, what does it mean to be an HSI? And could it be an identity, one of many identities that institutions have? And so I think about this as an identity, as identity work. So if any of you have ever thought about identity work as an individual, or even working with your students, how do individual students come into their identity? That's how I think about HSI, as an identity that you can embrace and come to know. And so as somebody who had studied racial identity development of people in my master's program, I thought a lot about what if the organization could go through various stages. I know stage-based models are definitely disrupted, but various ways in which they lean into the HSI identity, which is why it became a typology and not a stage-based model, because I don't think HSIs move linearly through any sort of progression to the HSI identity. I think that people move in various ways within the organization to move the institution towards that top quadrant here, which is that Latinx serving quadrant. I don't know how many of y'all recently saw this article that was published. It's an opinion piece, and I want to be clear, it's an opinion, not empirically founded article, but an opinion piece written by a chancellor of one of the University of California campuses that called for a tiering of HSIs. The fact that I saw the word tier in this article, it's an Inside Higher Ed, feel free to Google it and analyze it and deconstruct it with me, but be critical of it. This chancellor calls for a tiering of HSIs and basically says that only super, quote unquote, super HSIs should be funded. And that article threw me into a tailspin for multiple days. I was struggling with that article because to me, everything I am about and I write about and advocate for HSIs, I would never advocate for any sort of super HSI or tiering system or throwing out or kicking people off the island, to use an analogy of getting rid of the ones that are underperforming, because performance is only one way in which HSIs can show up and be HSIs. And so to say that HSIs should be super if they are producing very high graduation rates, I think it's missing the rest of the ways in which HSIs can be HSIs. And that's what this typology captures. And what I think that article was really missing was that, although there were parts of it that I think got at the structural organizational structures, but without using those terms. I don't think this chancellor has ever read any of my work. So they didn't get at any of that structural things, but they did definitely get at production. How do you produce more equitably graduation rates, right? Graduation rates, or if you're a community college, transfer rates, or whatever it is that you want to produce as an institution. I 100% believe that HSIs should do that work and should do it equitably, that we need to figure out how to equitably graduate or transfer or produce economic post-college graduation outcomes for students. We definitely have to do that work. But going back to the idea of a feeling, that's what the organizational structures in this typology gets to, is like, just because you graduate, let's say you graduated every single student that exited, but every day that they walked on campus, they experienced racism. That to me is not an HSI. So that would put you up in that Latinx producing. If you graduated 100% of your students, you're up there, congratulations, in that top left quadrant. But if they reported on their way out, like, yeah, I experienced racism every single day, right? I experienced microaggressions every single day. I experienced anti-Blackness every single day. You're not in that serving category because you haven't addressed your structures. You haven't addressed the feeling that you get at an HSI if it was to become a space of liberation. So to me, producing, you can be a producer all you want, but it doesn't actually get at all the various ways in which HSIs could become spaces of liberation and justice. That's my freedom dream. That's where I push us to think structurally, what do you got to do within the curriculum, within the co-curricular structures, within the engagement, within the community that you're working with and serving, all of those things, the various ways in which people are experiencing the campus, all of that gets at the culture, right? Which would then move you up into that top quadrant. So I think the quadrant still has a lot of value, even though I've created other frameworks. This quadrant is still really powerful for people. Like, they can see themselves in it. Like, if I asked all of you, if we were all together to go to one of the corners of the room that fits one of these that you think your HSI is, you could probably go to it, even without strong data to show that you would go to that area. You could probably go to your quadrants because you can feel it. You know what it's like on your campus. So I think the typology still has a tremendous amount of value for people. Let's talk about the diversity of students at HSIs. So I talk about HSIs as some of the most compositionally diverse institutions in the country. I stand by that 100%. I think HSIs are the most compositionally diverse institutions in the entire country, and the data here show that. So the bottom two bars are four-year public and private institutions, and you can see the Latinx student enrollment is over 50%. This is obviously averages, right? So it varies across campuses, but 50 to 70, 60.9% Latino students. But then you can see all the rest of the bars, the yellow, the green, the blue, are Black, Asian American, other people of color on campus, making up a majority of the campus. And so to think about HSI, I encourage y'all to think about HSI as inclusive of other racially minoritized groups, not just Latino students. Obviously, you're going to want to think about the H and HSIs, but it shouldn't be exclusionary work. And that's another question I often got early on as I would give talks, is like, well, HSI to me feels like it then excludes, right? And people don't want to exclude. We don't want to exclude nobody. We're not about exclusion, particularly in California, post 2009. That's always been a really tense topic of like, we can't include race. We can't have race conversations. We don't want to exclude anybody. I say, yes, we can. And we can say we're going to be, spaces of racial justice, right? Because we can, particularly HSI is a federal designation, and you can still lean into the H and the racial justice part of the identity. Also, we know HSIs by definition include low-income students, because there is a requirement that 50% of the population does identify as low income. You can get a waiver. So some HSIs, they kind of teeter on that income variable, but some are well over 50%. Some are serving 60, 70, 80% low-income students. That has major implications for the kind of work you're doing to serve students. So by definition, HSI work cannot be one dimension. It must be intersectional because we're talking about Hispanic, a racialized ethnicity, and low income that are included within that H. So to go into HSI work and say it's exclusionary and not intersectional is doing a disservice to HSI by definition. We also know that HSIs have large percentage of first gen to college students and first gen to the US. Y'all are on these campuses, so you know, right? You know who your students are you're serving. These are just the data to show you, yes, this is who's at HSIs, right? Majority HSIs on the bars here are over 50% low income. That two-year private's a little bit off because there's not that many two-year privates. So to see that large of a number feels like, wow, they're really serving high low income students, but it's also a smaller number in the two-year privates. We don't have a lot of information about the other intersections at HSIs in research. So I list many different intersectional identities in the book and also here to think about how do we start to lean into all the intersections that are probably at our HSIs, even if we don't have good data to know how many LGBT students do we have, queer students, trans students, gender non-binary, non-Christian, disabled, neurodivergent, formerly incarcerated, foster youth, right? Do we have good data of those? Not necessarily undocumented, right? Like we don't have good data for those populations, but we know they're there. We know they're at HSI. So how do we do this work in intersectional ways, knowing that the H in HSI is super duper diverse? One of the things that I think a lot about is the ways in which we describe students at HSIs. And these are some of the descriptors that we see in the data and the research, right? So when I read a research article, I might see part-time enrollment, underprepared for college, low SAT/ACT scores, low math scores. They might be in developmental courses. These descriptors are true, right? Many of them are true. They're factual, they're grounded in truth, but in many ways they create a deficit narrative. So it's like, oh, they're in developmental courses, and then deficit words come out of our mouths to talk about it. They're underprepared for college, deficit, deficit, deficit. Low SAT, ACT scores, deficit, 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 blaming of the students. And so in this work, I challenge us to be equity minded, right? And this isn't a new concept. We talk about equity minded a lot, particularly in California, drawing in Estela Bensimone's wonderful work, right? It's like, how do we disrupt that? Even when we know this is the descriptors of our students, how do we say yes, but we understand that these things are true because there may be an inequitable distribution of resources in primary and secondary schools that our students went to. There might have been a lack of access to advanced placement courses. There may have been a lack of access to information about financial aid. To use some of the growing terms that are being used in educational research, our student spirits may have been murdered prior to them getting to us based on their identities, right? That it's hard to be in educational structures that don't see or value the intersections of your identity. So they might arrive with quote unquote murdered spirits, right? They've been told all along that they were lesser than for a variety of reasons. They may face housing insecurities, food insecurities, healthcare disparities. All of these things we know are true. So how do we say yes, all those descriptors are true of our students, but it's because of these things, structural things, and then we move into serving them anyways, right? Because they're here. So how do we move into serving our students? And so the Transforming HSIs framework really is about racial equity and race consciousness. I like the little image at the bottom. Many of us have seen this, like the equality, equity. Not as many have seen this idea of liberation, just completely tearing down the wall, right? Equity, of course, is giving students what they need in order to succeed within a system that oppresses them. How do we get rid of the wall altogether? That's how I think about transforming HSIs. If we're really going to transform HSIs for racial equity and do it through race conscious ways of thinking and knowing, we're going to get rid of the wall altogether, right? How do we just knock it down? That's how I think about transformation. That's how I think about this idea of creating spaces of liberation where we don't have to even have equity conversation because we're in a space where we've already disrupted all the structures that are creating the inequities. That's that race equity. That's that race consciousness. I think another thing I think about a lot is that we've started to have an equity conversation without race. And to me, it's leaning towards the diversity conversation. As diversity started to get sort of watered down, is because we started to not have a one good, clear definition of diversity. Diversity started to be a lot of things. So encourage us in this work to constantly keep race there at the center of our equity work. Yes, do equity work, but do racial equity work, right? Recognize that race and racism are part of our normal lives, that race is embedded within our structures, that race is the reason why inequities are happening, right? So how do we make sure we continue to center race in our work and not do equity work without a connection to the actual identities of our students? Racial equity work. So that drives throughout the Transforming HSIs framework. I talk a lot about social justice in the book as well, and in the framework about redistribution of resources. Right, that's a key idea within social justice literature, is like a redistribution of resources so that folks get what they need to get to survive. Right, but redistribution of resources, that's big in an institution of higher ed with big budgets and big resources. Right, how do we redistribute resources so that folks get what they need to get? And this is an interesting conversation in HSIs and in higher ed in general, as we know that often the programs and resources that work on college campuses are the ones that are under-resourced and undervalued. For example, how often have we seen maybe EOP programs or TRIO programs or ethnic studies programs on the extreme margins of the institution? Sometimes literally on the margins. I've been on campuses where those programs are honestly on the margins. They're not even at the center of campus. They're on the margins, doing the hard work, actually serving students, but not getting the resources or the recognition for the work that they even deserve, right? Those programs work. We know it. We know they work for creating spaces of liberation. How do we elevate them versus putting them to the margins? I've written about this. I wrote about how do you scale up an ethnic studies program? How do you scale up an EOP program? And I learned that with the site that I worked with for my dissertation, in the various ways in which they had done that work. And it was powerful to see, like, wow, you can actually scale up the programs that do work, but we know that that's not often what happens. We're chasing dollars. We're chasing the federal government's ideas of servingness. We're chasing other things and not thinking what is actually working on our campus. How do we redistribute resources so that they actually are serving the students that we say we're committed to serving, that it's in our mission? I'll talk about mission in a minute. It's in our mission, but we're not actually doing that work, right? So social justice, I think it's such an important part of social justice, is that equitable distribution of resources. I draw on, I'll get to Victor Rice there in a second. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The final dimension that I talk about in the book is like collective liberation. I draw on liberation from Paulo Freire's ideas of from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a way in which to think about education as a site of freedom and as a site of liberation, but we're not there. Right? It's a dream. Paulo Freire dreamed that up in 1970, and we're still dreaming about it. We're still thinking about it. Me and other urban ed scholars have been dreaming about freedom within educational spaces forever. And unfortunately, we're watching right now, literally right now, if we turn on the news, there's some sort of attack on spaces of education doing critical work, right? Banning books, banning critical race theory, which is off the wall, because most people who are talking about critical race theory don't even have no idea what critical race theory is, right? There's banning of all these ways in which we could create freedom, right? Sites of freedom, educational spaces that are sites of freedom. All of that's being banned and pushed out. So we have to imagine that when our students arrive, they've been through their educational pathways, not having yet had education as a site of liberation and justice. How does HSIs do that? Because guess what? We can. Right? Even with all the banning and whatnot goes on, we're still going to continue to do the work at a post-secondary level, which is awesome. It's an awesome space to be in right now in higher ed, to still be able to generally do that work, right? We can. We're not under the radar as much as like the K through 12 schools are. But imagining our students going through those systems that haven't allowed them to see education as a site of freedom and a source of freedom. The other thing is I think about the collective, right? How do we do HSI work across intersections and not just for the H, which isn't a monolith. The H is super complex. We can't do one sort of way of serving when that H is so complex, which I already kind of shared earlier on. So I'm going to present to you a couple pieces of the Transforming HSI model. There's 9 dimensions to the transforming HSI model. But I'm going to just share little pieces of it with you. Hopefully this is like the preview to the book. The book should be out by January 2023, what I'm told by my editor. But for now, we're just gonna lean into some of these ideas, and then hopefully it'll come to more understanding once the book is out. And I know y'all will all get it and read it, not because I'm in the process of selling books or anything, but I expand on all of these ideas in the book. So mission, I talk about mission. I mentioned mission earlier on. Mission, interestingly, the more time I spend with mission, the more I realize that missions are mostly performative. I'm going to say it again. Missions are mostly performative. When you read a mission of an institution of higher ed, almost always there's something about we embrace diversity and inclusion. And that's it. There's no other acknowledgement of what that means, what kind of diversity for who, no mentions of race, no mentions of race consciousness and racial equity, nothing. And so mission is one of the important dimensions I asked y'all to grapple with, right? And missions can be institutional, but they can also be department wise, right? So if you're in a department and you're able to like control what goes on in that department, think about it. What's your mission? Or is your mission centered on servingness and this idea of racial equity, social justice, collective liberation? I use this example. This comes from Lindsay Malcolm Pica and Estela Ben-Simon, who really, I think, were some of the early people who are saying you have to have HSI in your mission. I agree. If you're going to be federally funded and getting millions of dollars from the federal government to be an HSI, why wouldn't you put it in your mission? Because it's exclusionary, or because you don't like Hispanics, or what is it, right? It brings a lot of questions when I look at a mission and think, well, why wouldn't you put that in? It's a federal designation. That's all it is, until you make meaning of it. And that's what I think the work that I do and the framework and all these different ideas I present are about, the meaning making of HSI. That HSI is just a federal designation, and it literally is based on descriptors of students. It has no meaning until you make meaning of it as an institution, as people within an institution. So I read this mission. We are a comprehensive regional Hispanic serving university with an educational outlook based on values of equity, excellence, and inclusiveness. Okay, inclusiveness still there. Equity doesn't say race, but I'll take it. More college educated Latinos and Latinas are imperative for the economic and social well-being of California. I highlight that part because it's so important, I think, to acknowledge where we're doing this work and why it would be important in the region that you're in to actually care about the advancement and the social mobility of the largest population on your campus, right? If it's Latinos, then you should care about that population. Nevertheless, we have a long way to go in order to achieve a Latino, Latina college educated population that is proportional to the representation in California. I love that piece because it says we are not there. That takes away that performative piece that we see, like, we're committed to diversity and inclusion. Great. How? What do you do? Right? What's the enactment? This is saying we're committed, but also we're not even close to being there. Like, what an important thing to say we're working towards it, but we're not there, because HSIs, like I said, are not there. HSIs are all trying to figure it out. As a Hispanic Serving University, we hold ourselves accountable for increasing the number of college-educated Latinos and Latinas. What is your mission as an HSI? What are you trying to do? How do you move into that production, right? That production type that I talked about in that typology. How do you move up into that area, right? Educating, but also what happens once they leave? I think a lot about post-college outcomes. Like, what are we doing to create critically conscious people who go out and serve our communities? Because they're only with us for 4 or 5 or 6 years, right? At most. Well, I don't know. I know when I was in the Cal State system, there are people that were there a while. So it could be longer, but they're only with us for a short amount of time versus the lifespan of their life that they could be giving back and committed to their own communities. Because we know most students will go back out into their own communities and not leave, right? Most people don't leave very far, particularly Latino students. Identity is one of the dimensions that I talk about in the model that really is driven from my early work. That typology that I shared was identity. That was HSI identity. I talk about this in some of my work, later work after I proposed the typology. I then talked about HSI identity being transitional or ideal. right? Like it's an idealized identity. We're trying to get to it, but most of us have not fully gotten there, which is why I am against anything like a super HSI. There's no super HSI. Nobody's there. We're trying, we're striving, trying to figure out how to enact and center servingness, right? Servingness, another term I've talked about in various ways, like all of this servingness. Why isn't it just serving, Gina? People ask me that. Why isn't it just serving? Servingness isn't a word, because servingness is the embodiment of all of this. All of this I'm talking about, that's servingness, right? To embrace all of these things is an enactment of servingness versus only focusing on one dimension. So in the identity typology, I talked about outcomes. Remember that, like outcomes was on the left. The culture, the environment was on the bottom. I have since added experiences. Like if I had to rethink that identity model, I would add experiences. And the reason is because the research is very clear and strong right now that the number of microaggressions and racism and anti-Blackness within HSIs is very, very prevalent. And that gets back to my statement that, like, if you're graduating all your students, but they're experiencing racism every day, you're not an HSI. You're not super in any sort of way. You need to address those experiences. So I add experiences to this because I think it's such an important thing for us to think about. Even if you're creating that culture, that environment that feels empowering and validating, even if you're producing in equitable ways on your outcomes, how are the experiences? What are people reporting? Did the campus police racially profile your Black students? Did they, inappropriately address them? Like all of these various ways, right? Do we see anti-Asian or Asian hate happening? All the different ways in which we're thinking about the identities in our campuses, those all go to the experiences. And there's strong research to show, and I think I have a slide on that, we're just not there. There's racism and microaggressions on our campus, and we know it, but we have to start talking about it because it's part of servingness. The strategic purpose is the third dimension of the model, and this is where we really get into measures. So in the framework of servingness, that's a whole different framework. I know I'm a frameworks person, so I try to give people tools for thinking about servingness. In the servingness framework, I call them indicators of serving. How do you know you're serving students? This is the strategic purpose. This is where we put it in the strategic purpose. These are the indicators. And so the indicators are equitable educational outcomes, and it could be a ton of educational outcomes. There's all kinds of things we want to do. We want to have, equitable STEM degree production. We want equitable transfer if you're a 2-year. We want equitable, graduate enrollment, postgraduate enrollment. The data are strong that Latino students are not enrolling in HSIs at the same amount for graduate school as they are undergrad. The disparities are huge. That an institution that might have 60% undergraduate Latino identified people might have like 20 or 10% graduate enrollment. Huge differences between your undergrad and your graduate population. Are we encouraging students to go on to graduate school? Are we telling them that they can see themselves in graduate school? Are we asking them, hey, what PhD program are you going to? Nobody ever asked me that. I was a student at Cal State Northern. Nobody ever said, what PhD program are you going to? I'd been like, what's a PhD program? Right? That's real, that our students might not even know what graduate school is. I didn't know the difference between a BA and a BS and an MA and an MS and a PhD. No clue. No clue as an undergraduate student. As a first generation to college student, I had no idea what any of that was. So how are we encouraging our students and providing them with that capital, right? That social capital to understand even that they can succeed, that they can graduate and then go on, right? And then go on to the next level. What's that graduate, graduate going pipeline? Are we an HSI that builds a good, strong graduate going pipeline? I haven't even written about that. Well, I shouldn't use pipeline, pathway. That would be a moment when y'all could have called me in for sure. Pathway. I know that's a word I'm definitely trying to get rid of in my, in my language, acknowledging that pipelines are an important issue for the Native American community in the United States, particularly as pipelines are often going through and damaging Native communities. So think about pathways. Are you creating a graduate going pathway at your HSI? Because that could be a really important indicator of serving that you're creating more pathways into graduate school. Jobs, are your students getting a job? Are they becoming socially mobile, economically mobile? All of those things matter. The liberatory outcomes, this is where it gets really fun. How do you measure liberation? If we're actually becoming spaces of liberation, how do we measure that? Now, this is where my entire research agenda is going. So I can't tell you I have a lot of strong evidence of this because I don't. This is my freedom dream. This is where I've turned all of my focus. I'm literally about to submit an NSF grant to do this work. All right, like tomorrow. It's in the work. I was in grant writing mode all day long to think about what are liberatory outcomes at HSIs and with this NSF project in STEM. All right, what does it look like in STEM? How do you create critical consciousness in STEM? How do you create students that are committed to going back out and serving their communities, what Ebony McGee calls equity ethic, right? That they want to go out and serve their communities with their STEM degrees. Not just make a lot of money, not just go out and be engineers, but actually go out and make a change in their communities, right? There's so many ways in which we can measure liberatory outcomes, but we got to do that work. So I'm working on that. I'm gonna start producing that work. So don't worry, because people often ask me, say more about the liberatory outcomes, right? I want to know more. How do we measure that stuff? How do we know we're a site of liberation, a space of liberation? Well, let's try to measure it, because higher ed wants to measure things. Validating experiences is the opposite of racism. This is that our students actually feel like they're validated in the classroom, in the co-curricular structures, on campus, everywhere they go, that they feel validated, they feel like they belong, all of those things. They get mentored by people like them. All of those things come up in this strategic purpose part. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because equity goals, benchmarking equity goals, this is something that y'all have been talking about, particularly in California. So I'm going to skip right over that one. I already talked a little bit about deficit language, but I want to just remind us that as we're doing this work, remember that when our students arrive, they arrive with community cultural wealth, right? Tara Yoso's work on community cultural wealth is so important because it's essential to us seeing our students as valued and also becoming those spaces of liberation. I was just talking to a person who wants to think, how do I better support, it was a funder who wants to better support HSIs. And I was like, well, and they were talking about career outcomes. And I was like, well, what about bilingual careers? What if we focused on HSIs doing better work around bilingualism and helping students to be bilingual in their careers? Like if they want to be a nurse, how do you be a bilingual nurse? Because bilingual in your house is not the same as being a bilingual nurse, right? Nurses have to know some pretty technical language. Do students learn that in their homes? Probably not, right? So how do you create more bilingual future folks to go out and serve the community, right? So language as an asset versus language as a deficit. Right? That like, yeah, we're going to embrace language and our students are coming with multiple languages, right? We know that it's not just Spanish. There's many languages that our students show up with. How do we embrace that and see that as a value, right? Rethinking the deficit ways in which we think about students and starting to center those identities. This is the slide that I said, the systemic racism, there's way too many words on here. I don't even want you to try to read the words, but basically the summary of this slide is that all these scholars, and I can name 5 more off the top of my head, have written recently about systemic racism or anti-Blackness or microaggressions in HSIs. The more research that comes out about it, the more I'm like, we got to disrupt it. The person who reviewed my book, I got reviews from the book for this book. I actually outlined entire section of the microaggressions and systemic racism. I said, this person said, I said, Sanchez said this, Desai and Ibeta said this, Cuellar and Johnson Arulo said this. Like I one by one went through and described all these various ways in which microaggressions are showing up. The person responded to that. I don't know who it was. Obviously it's anonymous, but basically said like, these don't seem strong enough. You're basically claiming the institution is violent and racist. And these examples don't seem strong enough. I'm like, how much more strong do you want me to get? I actually have empirical evidence. I'm citing the empirical evidence and giving like summaries of every single article. Like that's how much I wanted to elevate this conversation. The person felt like it wasn't enough. And I'm like, if any form of racism is happening on your campus, it's violent. It's absolutely violent and it's absolutely not going to get you that space of liberation. Let me check my time, make sure we have time to engage in Q&A. I'm almost through the slides. Membership is a piece of the dimension. All I really want to say with this is thinking about all the various ways in which the membership needs to be more diverse, because most people focus on faculty, that faculty at HSIs need to be more diverse. I 100% get behind that. I agree. But what about your administrators? right? Your high-level administrators, are they diverse? Are they showing up in the same ways that our students do? Do they have similar identities as our students? What about your trustees, your alumni that actually engage with the campus? What do they look like? Your graduate students, like I said, I already talked about some data that show that graduate student population is much wider at an HSI than the undergraduate population. Families, I even bring families into the membership dimension. It's very underdeveloped. I think there's a lot more work to be done around that. And I'm not the scholar that's doing a lot of family work, but I'm trying to find the folks that are doing the family work, because I think it's such an important piece of like, how do we bring our families into HSI, right? How do we bring the community into HSI? All of these folks can be part of our membership. So how do we assess the composition of multiple members, not just faculty? Because faculty aren't the only people that got to do HSI. Like, people put a lot of pressure on faculty to be the like drivers of HSI, but faculty are only one part of this. It's everybody. You know who's undervalued in this work? Classified staff. I have yet to find an article, and I'm gonna write that article myself, because when I don't see it, I'm like, well, guess I gotta do it. Classified staff, the folks who interact with students on a daily basis, could be very powerful drivers of servingness, and we just don't even think about it in that way. They're not even invited often to the conversation, the HSI workshop that I give on campus. They're not even invited. Why? Because they're on the front line serving the students often, right? So how do we bring in all these folks into this idea of servingness as a multidimensional way to approach this work? I talk about leadership and governance, and those concepts alone could be their own book. So I'm not going to talk extensively about them, but governance for sure. We've got to think about how are we making decisions. But I talk a lot about leadership also in the framework, and I talk about leaders being all of us. Every single person listening to me right now, y'all are all leaders, right? Every single person who walks on that campus or makes their way into the campus are leaders, right? So how do we do good leadership work from the margins if we're leading from the margins? And these are some various dimensions that I've talked about in some of my other work about understanding our own identities as we go and doing leadership work, engaging in critical conversations like the ones y'all are having over these couple days that you're spending together, accessing critical theory, not being afraid of critical theory, recognizing inequity, talking about race, building consensus. All of that is part of the leadership that happens at HSIs and that I get to experience, because I get to spend time with HSIs and I get to see it happening all the time. The infrastructure, this is the piece that most people like understand because it's tangible. They're like, oh, the curriculum. I as a faculty member, I produced a curriculum. I'm responsible for the pedagogy on campus, co-curriculum, right? If you're in the co-curricular structure, support services, you get that, right? The physical infrastructure, that's the murals I talked about in the beginning. This is the most tangible piece, but also I think the piece that we have tried to put all of servingness onto, that these are the dimensions. All of these things have to happen and be a part of the HSI identity, but it's not, there's too many dimensions to it to just say, if the curriculum changes, the entire institution is now an HSI. Curriculum's got to change, yes, but it can't be the only driver of HSI. There's so many different dimensions to it. And so in the book, I talk about liberatory education across the infrastructure. How do we develop meaningful relationships with students across the infrastructure? How do we center their ways of knowing, their socio-political identities, their histories, their ways of knowing? How do we do that? How do we help to develop critical consciousness and social action within students across the curriculum? I set that liberatory outcomes that I'm talking about, even within STEM. I'm like, I'm going to do this work in STEM because I often get asked like, well, how do we do this in STEM, Dr. Garcia? I'm like, I don't know, but let's do research. Let's figure it out. It's kind of my answer to everything. Let's do some research. Let's find some empirical evidence of it, because I believe in it. All right. If y'all haven't picked up by now, I'm a believe, right? Like, I believe in these things. I am an optimist. I think we can do it. We got to do it. Right? We can't just sit around thinking that's going to happen, because it's not. No super HSI exists. No model HSI exists. We've got to do the work. The grassroots leaders are often the people who I get to work with, who I think are the ones doing the work from the margins. I bet you anything, it's most of y'all in this session right now. Y'all are the ones leading from the margins often. You don't necessarily have the highest level of a position on campus, but you're working for change. You're working within the structures. You're hacking the system. I love that idea. I had to throw that in this article that I read, that the citations down on the right, it talks about decolonizing higher ed, which I've talked about decolonizing higher ed in some of my work, and they talk about hacking the system. Like, ooh, that fits right with the grassroots leaders concept, right? That you're within the system, but you're hacking away because you want to change it for better, right? So not hacking it to shut it down, but hacking it to change it, to create a space of liberation and justice for your students and for everybody on campus. I've talked about institutional agents as HSIs. These are people who have access to capital and that redistribute it to people that need it, especially students. That's the core definition of institutional agents. People with high level positions and power and resources that redistribute it. That's that redistribution, that social justice. If you have the ability and the power and the resources to redistribute resources, that's a part of this. That's a part of this freedom dream for HSIs. This is the Ray theory. I knew I had this theory somewhere, the Victor Ray theory of racialized organizations. In the book, I talk about Victor Ray proposed this model and said organizations are racialized. And I agree 100%, totally racialized. But he proposes these 4 dimensions and says they're racialized because these things. And I say, well, if we disrupt those things, that's equity and justice work, right? That's that racial equity work. So he says, you know, racialized organizations credential whiteness. So I say, well, let's decredential whiteness then. Or how do we decredential? What does that even mean? Like, how do we knock down whiteness? Credentialing is like, you know, we think about credentialing and like licensing, right? Or like within our own different ways, like in social workers or nurses, right? Different ways in which you get credentials, faculty, right? We get different credentials. How do you decredential whiteness, right? Because whiteness has been credentialed. It's the normative within institutions. How do you decredential it? How do you redistribute resources? Because he says in racialized organizations, resources and power are not distributed, equitably. I agree. How do we do that? How do we start to redistribute? He says that race is decoupled from our policies and our practices. Absolutely. This is why diversity and inclusion and equity work, or the JEDI work that's starting to go on campus, often doesn't work very well, or people get burnt out because they're doing the work, but it's decoupled. The race and diversity and equity work is decoupled from the actual policies and practices on campus. Means nobody's getting rewarded for doing that work. Nobody's getting resources for doing that work. It's not even in the strategic plan. So how are we going to do racial equity work if it's not actually coupled with our policies and our practices? So I talk about that. How do you couple race in what you're doing? Empower the people of color, the grassroots leaders, the hackers, those of us on campus who actually are committed to changing the institution. Empower those people. Because you know what? We're going to do the work anyways, but we would like a little acknowledgement every once in a while, right, that we're actually doing the work, because we get tired. Folks get tired and they leave. How do we keep them from leaving? We acknowledge that the work that they do matters. The final dimension is the external environment. I talk a lot about the whole chapter just on the external environment, but how do we do this work within a climate that is sometimes contentious? Like the picture of the person here on screen who says, stop teaching critical race theory to our kids. How do we do critical work when there's folks like that who are saying, get rid of critical theory, get rid of critical race theory? Or how do we do this? Our dreams unite us, right? How do we do this work with dreamers, despite the fact that some states are attacking the DREAM Act, right, and not empowering undocumented students or documented students? Ethnic studies now, California's been fighting for ethnic studies since I was an undergrad, right? We've been fighting for ethnic studies, and it's finally becoming policy, and that's awesome. But even before it was policy, there's been folks, right? Folks in this meeting right now who have been fighting for ethnic studies. I'm a daughter of ethnic studies, and 100% believe in it, right? How do we do ethnic studies work even when the climate says no ethnic studies? Because California is unique compared to some of these other states that are up on this top right. So there's all these different ways in which the external environment is telling us to do things or not do things, right? And so how do we continue to be committed to justice and equity and liberation, despite the fact that higher ed is often responding to a lot of different things? We got to be able to align ourselves with the things we agree with, like a fight for ethnic studies as part of our servingness, and not align with things like the attack on CRT. We're like, all right, we're going to push that to the side. Can we do that? And how do we do that? Or how do we still do the work even though that's happening in our state, if it is? Talk a lot, I know. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and give us a little chance. Oh, it got dark. It's 6:30 over here, yeah, in the East Coast. So I think we're going to question and answer time. think we have a good amount of time too. I tried to
Yes,
give it
yes,
time.
yes, we are. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. A lot to think about there. I'm going to ask folks in our audience to please drop questions in the Q&A. But I will start us off. Dr. Garcia, how do we get folks to do the work? You know what happened at my campus when you came. I called out our anti-Blackness problem and we got crickets in the discussion. Our Latinx faculty at this HSI will not step up. I mean, we've got our Black faculty, staff who are pouring their heart and soul into a proposal for a Black resource cultural center. And we're already hearing grumbles of, well, you know, you can't get that if we don't get a Latinx center because we're an HSI. They are not even asking for one. And the activist work is being done by Black faculty and staff, but then we get stopped and say, well, you know, you're an HSI, so we've got to do this. If you're not asking for it, you don't get it. If you're not fighting for it, you don't get it. So in the calling in, because I want to try to practice more calling in, how do we get these folks to get to work?
Yeah. That's such a great question. I wish I had the answer. That's one of those, like, I've tried to answer, there were like a bunch of $1 million questions that I was like, okay, I'll try to answer that one, try to answer that one. That one I haven't answered yet. Because I think it's part of that liberation, that collective liberation, right? That like people are so like thinking it's like zero sums game, right? Like if you get, then I don't get. And that's the problem, right? Until we're able to disrupt that, we're not going to get anywhere, because if there's only so many seats at the table, well, then bring in another table, right? Bring in multiple tables, bring in more chairs, knock down the wall and create another room, right? Like where we can do this work. So I think that's part of it, right? Is that people are so focused on like, well, if you get that, I don't get that. All right, I don't get that, whatever it is that you're fighting for. And I just think it's not going to get us anywhere. We're never going to get to that space of liberation and justice. I talk a lot about the fact that our HSIs do enroll Black students, Native American students, Asian American students for a reason, right? Because I agree. I think a lot of it turned to like, well, we're an HSI, so it can be H only. And that's just not true, because HSI, I show the data for a reason, right? It very clearly are diverse in multiple ways, right? And even if your Black student population is 4%, it's 4%, right? Like, I don't care what the number is, it's still a population that is still a population that you have to care about. And that is part of this, like, if we're going to do racial equity work, is part of the racial equity work. So I think we have a lot of work to do, right? Till we get to that point where people actually view liberation as a collective effort versus me versus you. And I don't know exactly that there's ways we can do it besides the way I talk about empowering the people of color, right? It's like empowering people of color on campus is one of the ways I think we can. Is like if we are like rewarding or providing resources for those folks who are advocating and writing the proposals and doing the work, well, then you got to do the work too, right? Because that work is being rewarded, right? And so at higher levels, I think that's one thing to think about, right? Is like, are our higher levels, are our administrators valuing that work? Because if they are, people are gonna have to take notice, right? That like, you know why folks are getting the work? Because they're doing the work. I am at a campus that, like I said, one of the whitest, campuses in the country. Latino population is like 3% here. Okay, someone who writes about HSIs, I'm at a campus with like 3% Latino population at our student undergraduate level. I am the one that's leading, Hispanic Heritage Month efforts. I'm the one launching a whole virtual conference for Latinx Connect. And guess what? I'm getting resources. It took a couple years, and people could easily say, well, why is she getting resources? Because she's working with a population that's like the smallest. It is. It's one of the smallest if you think about the racial ethnic population on campus. And I'm like, because I'm doing the work, right? Like I'm doing the work and the folks are noticing it, right? Like the chancellor of equity, diversity, and inclusion is like, I see Gina. All right, we're gonna hook Gina up, right? It took me 4 years before I even got any kind of university budget. I was pulling money out of my pocket, right? I'm like, I'm gonna do it, right? And my colleagues were too. Like, we're gonna do the work, whether the university commits to it or not, right? And that's the reality. Is we are gonna do the work, whether the university commits to it or not. But I guess I just believe that eventually the university gotta pay attention. They're gonna have to pay attention to us, because otherwise, I used to say, I'm gonna tie myself. Our mascot is called the Panther. It's a panther. I'm like, I'm tying myself to the Panther. If they don't fund my proposal, I'm tying myself to the Panther. And one of my colleagues in diversity, equity, inclusion said, please don't tie yourself to the Panther. We'll do it. We'll listen, Gina. And they did, right? They started responding, because I'm like, I will do the protest if I have to, right? Because we're here, even if we're small. And so I think that's the reality, is like, those of us that are doing the work, we're gonna eventually get people's attention. So, everybody got to do their own work, and we should be doing it collectively. But if you're not, get out the way, and we're gonna do it anyways.
Thank you. That's great. We have a couple of really great questions. First one's from my colleague, Dr. Parnasina. How does a future where students of color are no longer considered underserved look like? And how do we make our institutions for them?
Yeah. Oh, I actually was in a meeting today with the Association for Governing Boards, and that was actually a statement I heard today. And I was like, I do like that statement, but will we ever get there? They actually said, we're going to get to a point where we don't have to use equity, because equity is just going to be present. And I'm like, I don't know, in our lifetime, right? Like, I'm skeptical of that, because I'm like, I'm going to keep working for it regardless throughout my whole career, but I don't know that we're going to get there, right? And I mean, I think about Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, racial realism, basically talking about that exact thing, that even if we never get to racial justice, you still fight for it. Well, we're gonna keep fighting. We're gonna keep fighting until we can't fight no more, right? Or till we retire, I guess. But even then, I think we're gonna keep fighting. And so you do the work even if we never actually get there. So I think that's one thing. Is the racial realism is that we probably aren't going to see it in our lifetimes, and that's okay, right? We do the work anyways. We do it for the future generations, right? We do it for our children and our children's children and our students that we serve and their future families, right? We do it because it's the right thing to do, not because we necessarily are going to benefit from it, right? And so I think there's that, is recognizing that we might not get there. But if we do, I think there's the dimensions I talk about in the identity, when I was talking about the identity of HSIs, was that I think people are so driven by that outcomes piece in HSIs. And that's why I told the story of the chancellor that wrote that article, because that article was grounded in outcomes. If you're not producing equitable outcomes, you gotta get out the HSI, island. And I'm like, no, you don't. You gotta get out the HSI island, because your campus is racist, right? So I'm gonna kick you off before I kick them off. So the outcomes are so important, but that experience, right? Going back to that first slide, I talked about the murals and why I use murals in my talks, because that feeling, right? That feeling of HSI. So I think there's dimensions to it. Yeah, we're going to have equitable outcomes. If we ever get to that point, we're going to have more equitable experiences, where my colleague Tracey isn't saying, I experience anti-Blackness and nobody cares, right? And now the faculty are crickets and they don't even want to acknowledge it. We will get to a point where that didn't happen, that when anti-Blackness happens, everybody actually steps up before Tracey has to even do it, right? That's that collective liberation. It's hold the front door. We're not gonna, that's not gonna happen here, right? We're not gonna allow that to happen here, rather than saying, I don't know about this anti-Blackness thing. I'm not sure that it actually is a thing. It is a thing. And we witness it and we see it every day. When does everybody start calling it out? Right? That's that point. So I think the experiences where I don't have to have a session where somebody in the session tells me this happened at my campus and this was what followed up, right? Anti-Blackness happened and nobody cared. The point at which I don't have to hear that story anymore, we're closer, right? We're closer to that freedom dream. And where we just have structurally those structures, the curriculum, the co-curricular experiences, the engagement, the student support services, all those that are embracing our students and their full identities in the ways in which they know, right? And the ways in which they're arriving. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and it is multidimensional, which is why I'm so intentional about saying there's lots of ways that we can measure servingness.
Awesome. The next question is from actually one of my CSUB colleagues, Professor Carolyn Lane, which I think is an interesting question across the line for CSUs. And you spoke to the complexity of our students' identities. you know, where are our Afro-Latinos? How do we serve our Afro-Latino student population? You know, even in our example of building ethnic studies, we got told by the Latinos faculty it was on us to create curriculum for Afro-Latinos in Black studies. And I was like, really? You know, so, you know, what are your ideas on that? And how can we serve that group, pay more attention to that identity and people who may not feel comfortable stepping up to that identity? Because young people, it's like, I'm not accepted in either group. I'm in this no man's land. How do I fit in?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we have to address the dimensions of race, within the age, right? Within the Hispanic or within Latino, however you're gonna use the term you're gonna use. So I think it's big Afro-Latino conversation we need to have, but I think we also need to have the conversation about race within, right? We know Hispanic is not a race. It's racialized, and I talk about it as a racialized identity, but it's actually a pan-ethnic identity, right? Which means those boxes that we have to check, when you check Hispanic, you then have to check a race, right? Which is very emotional for many of us, because I'm like, well, I don't know which box I fit into. I don't fit into any of those. I'm not Black. I don't identify as white. I'm somewhere in the middle. There's no brown. Like I'm not indigenous, so I can't check native, right? Like, where the heck do I fit? And so there's a lot of just complexities to within the age. I think we need to recognize that first, right? The race within, that there are white Latinos, there's Black Latinos, Afro Latinos, and then there's a whole bunch of us in the middle, right? And so that race is what's playing into that exclusion of Afro-Latinos, because in a racial structure like the United States, white is good, Black is bad. We know that. That's how US operates, right? Like, in a simplistic way, I could say it in a much more complex way, but in a simplistic way, white is good, Black is bad. So white Latino good, Black Latino bad, right? Which is where this problem comes in, that we're not adequately serving our Afro-Latino students, because one, we don't recognize them, right? Oh, you're Black, but you speak Spanish? What, right? How many Afro-Latinos say that, right? That's a very common thing to say. Like, the minute I speak Spanish, all the Latino people that are not Black, non-Black Latinos are like, what, you speak Spanish? Where did you learn that, right? They're like, I grew up speaking Spanish. It's my first language, right? Like, what are you talking about? Afro-Latinos exist in large numbers. I encourage you to follow the work of my sister, scholar sister, Amalia Dache. She's doing excellent work around how do we better serve Afro-Latino students in education, and really pushing the narrative on like how this is a population you can't just discount, particularly when you think about Latin America, the whole diaspora. Afro-Latinos are across the whole diaspora. It's not just the Caribbean. It's not just the Dominican Republic. It's not just Puerto Rico. The entire, all of Latin America, all of South America have Afro-Latino people. Mexico has Afro-Latino people, right? So for one, understanding that, right, is such an important piece. We're talking about millions of Afro-Latino identified people, and then connecting it to, right, the racial conversation I think we have to have. And that's where the uncomfortable conversations come in, right? That's why your faculty on your campus don't want to have an anti-Black conversation, because race is uncomfortable. We got to talk about it. Right? It's within the Latino identity, and we need to have that conversation. Now, where does Afro-Latino, the support come from? It can come from both. It can come from Latino folks on campus. It can come from Black folks on campus. Why? Because Afro-Latinos fit into those, if we had to fit into all the boxes, it can be both. So to say you should do that, we're not going to do that, I think is inappropriate, right? It discounts the intersectional ways in which Afro-Latinos show up, right? That they are going to say yes to Latino things, yes to Black things, both. And right, it's an intersectional approach to it. So I think there's a lot of work to do around it. I know my campus, we have an Afro-Latino initiative, and we're actively having this conversation. And the folks that show up to that many of us are not Afro-Latino identified, and we are 100% committed to learning and growing and understanding what that means, right? How do we actually understand and serve our Afro-Latino students? Because we're doing them a disservice if we're not bringing race into the conversation and not acknowledging the intersectional identities.
Thank you. I would like to raise another question. scholar activists. Yesterday we had a great session put on in support with our CFA Latinx caucus on immigration. And they helped broaden the discussion that immigration is not just the DACA students or Latinx folks, that it is Black folks, it's Asian folks. But I would ask, as a scholar activist, how do we balance where, the immigration issue is a pressing issue. It's right now for many of our campuses. We have DACA students. It's frightening. It's violent. So how do we balance that? And then while press the other things that you were talking about with servantness, to do servantness with an emergency situation?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a good conversation. And actually, the reviewer I talked about to my book did bring up that like I didn't have enough in the book about undocumented students and immigration, which I think was a fair point. And I was like, that's a fair point. The book is largely based on existing research, right? Like I'm pulling on a lot of existing research, a lot of my own work with HSIs. It's like my own ways of knowing. And there is a lot of work around supporting our undocumented students. I think it's exactly to what you said, though, is that like we can't say that because we're an HSI, then we then necessarily are serving Latino undocumented students, because it's much more complicated than that, right? Undocumented is much more diverse than our Latino students, and there's various communities that fall into that category. And so people kind of weave in and out of like, does that fall under HSI or not? I think one of the big concerns is that we don't have good data to know those populations, because IPEDS data, the data that many of us use to understand the population on our campus, doesn't accurately account for undocumented students, because there's no category for an undocumented. That's literally the definition of undocumented, right? Like that our population is undocumented. So we're not adequately even capturing them in the data. So if I ask folks at HSIs, like, what is your population of undocumented students? They're often guessing. They're like, well, it's somewhere around this number or that number, because we don't even have solid numbers, right? So I think there is a data issue that we need to think about. Is like, how do we adequately serve our undocumented students if we don't even know who they are? Right? We got to start accounting for them a little bit better, which, we have to deal with the data structures that we have. Like, how can we account for students if there's not even a box that they check when they, apply? Because undocumented students are classified as international students, right? Which is a very different experience than undocumented. Very different experience from somebody who grew up in the United States, but is undocumented, right? Versus coming internationally just to go to school, right? For higher ed. So I think there's a lot of complexities to it. I've been thinking a lot about border HSIs. And like when we saw all the like news coming out about Haitian immigrants, being attacked by Border Patrol, I thought a lot about HSIs on the border. I was like, what is an HSI on the border? That's that HSI commitment to the community, right? Because I do think, and I didn't talk about it a lot in this talk, but I do talk about HSIs as committed to serving the community, right? So what is the commitment to serving the community? If you know your community has a large population of undocumented students, let's say in the Central Valley, right? California Central Valley, you might have migrant workers, you might have undocumented folks, you got, folks who are out in the fields, you got students, right? Who might be out in the fields, like acknowledging that that's your community and what are the needs of the community, right? How do we serve as an HSI that community, those communities that are a part of our community, even if we can't adequately account for them? We know in the local areas that's happening, right? Border HSIs know that the Border Patrol is treating people inhumanely, right? Like, how do we address that as a campus? Because it is a humanity issue, right? It is a justice issue. It is something that we got to think about as HSI. So I think it comes under the community component of it, and how do we better serve our local communities as HSIs.
Thank you. I'm going to keep encouraging our audience to put questions in the Q&A. I'm going to follow up again. Dr. Garcia, you talk about stop pointing out what students don't have and point what they do have, because that I am a great believer in that. Particularly, I'm deeply proud of my students. A lot of them are first generation college. What methods, what language would you suggest using to me? I think some of our students have a self-esteem problem, and when you start saying you don't have this and you don't know this, and then you sit in a classroom, as you said, and you've never heard of something. And it just makes you go boop, 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 like Pac-Man. You know, how can we uplift these students, because we know they face other things that they have to improve and they have to work on, and that we're
Yeah.
not slow, you know, a death of a thousand cuts. How do we work on that portion for our students to uplift them?
Yeah, for sure. I just had this conversation with my, so I talked about I'm applying for an, an NSF racial equity grant, and I was talking to my team, the research team that we put this together, and one of the liberatory outcomes we talk about in the proposal, and that I talk about was even on the slides, was racial identity development, or racial or ethnic identity development. And my colleague, who knows those scales very well, because we were trying to figure out which scales we wanted to use to measure this in our grant, he said, I don't know, I'm struggling with this being a liberatory outcome. These scales have been proposed by white people. They weren't proposed as liberatory when they first came up with it. It's created by ed psych folks who believe in these stages, right? There's all these problems, right, with the racial identity. And I challenged him. I said, okay, here's where I first started thinking about racial and ethnic identity as a form of liberation. Think about our students that show up with internalized racism, internalized oppression, because our students do, right? When you've been through an educational system, that's murdered spirits, right? Like that's what that is. That an educational system has told you over and over again, either the people, the teachers, the books, the curriculum, all these things that told you that you are not worthy because you're Black, because you're a woman, because you speak multiple languages, because English is your emerging language, whatever it may be, right? That you're not worthy. You internalize that. Right? That's an internalized process that it's hard not to do that when you want to just fit in, particularly as a kid, right? Kids just want to fit in. No kid wants to stand out. I got kids. I got a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. 12-year-old is solidly in that stage of like just fitting in, right? Like I just want to be accepted by my peers, right? My friends. And so anything you can do to just fit in with the mainstream ways of being is what you're going to do, right? Because that's that internalized oppression. So if we think about it like that, like there are so many forms of liberation for our students that have to happen, but we have to acknowledge that those murdered spirits, we're going to have to deal with that first. Right, that they're not going to just get here. We're going to boom, liberation. It was like that's what the courses are for. That's what the programs are for. That's what our experiences on campus are for, to allow them to get to that point of like those liberatory outcomes. So I absolutely see racial ethnic identity development as that. I see academic self-concept as that. Why? Because exactly, the going back to the definitions of our students coming in maybe underprepared for college or not feeling academically prepared to go through an experience and have a professor tell you over and over again that you're smart, you're worthy, you can do it, does increase your academic self-concept, right? So even just knowing that that is a form of liberation when our students have been told because of tests or whatever it may be, that they were not academically worthy. And there's so many ways in which our student experience have been murdered. And all of those are part of that like liberatory outcomes, right? The liberatory spaces that I think about. It's complex, and I think we can do it. And if anybody can do it, to Cal States. I believe in the Cal States. I believe in the California public systems of higher ed because I am a product of them, right? I believe that we can, but we got to think about it, right? Like in each dimension that we can do this work.
One last question here, because you've given me some homework with your term freedom dream, which I absolutely love. But this morning, Dr. Latson Billings was asked about, the 2050 thing where we will become a minority majority nation. And she basically said, we shouldn't count on outnumbering people because we won't have the power. And you said in your presentation that we won't necessarily reach this social equality dream in our lifetimes. But with 20, 25 years from now, Dr. Garcia is getting ready to retire and be Professor Emeritus. What would be your freedom dream? What would make you feel okay, knowing that there's still work to do, but you could rest knowing that you put your part in for your freedom dream?
Yeah. Oh, that's a deep question. I don't know what that point be. Hopefully it's sooner than 20 or 25 years. I'm ready to retire now.
Me
but
too.
there's work to do. But there's work to do, so I won't, and children to raise. I think knowing that there's so going back to this idea of like scholar activist, right? Like that's a term that people like push back on, like, what does that mean? Are you really a scholar activist, right? And I've grappled with that term about, like, am I scholar activist? What does that really mean? You know, activism on the ground versus activism through scholarship. You know, there's so many forms of activism. But I think of that, right? That, like, my work, my research as a form of activism, which is why I write in critical ways, but also as part of, like, with the freedom dream, right? Like, my work is eternally optimistic. Like, if you read my work, you'll get that, right? It's hard to see anything. I mean, it's critical. Like, I'm like, we got to fix all these things, but here's some ways we can do it, right? Like, I don't just, like, tear down the structures. I tear down the structures and then say, here's how you can build it back up, right? Here's tools, because nobody wants to be torn down without having any sort of hope that we could actually build back up. And so that's for me, that's a form of the scholar activism, right? That my own work is a form of activism, that people read my book and, like, come ask me to sign the book because they're like, I can't believe I'm meeting you, right? Like, can you sign my book? And I'm like, oh, I just write books because I believe it's what I believe in. It's what I'm dreaming about. So I think that, right, knowing that the work has impacted people, that the work has had an effect in practice. A lot of my work isn't about research only. It's actually about practice, right? How do we practically do this work? So knowing anytime somebody tells me that they, use my work in practice, that to me is the freedom dream, is chipping away at it, right? That I'm getting there. I got an email recently from a college president of an HSI major institution who said, I'm, going to be doing, going up in a hearing, right? Legislative hearing. And I'm citing your work. And here's my statement, and sent me the statement. And I was like, wow, like, that is so cool. Like, that my work is actually being used in that sort of way. So that I think is where I will feel like at least I've made some sort of impact on this work.
Righty. Thank you so much again, Gina, Gigi. I appreciate you. I knew you were going to knock it out the park.